The cost of renewable energy has gone down in recent years. That's made options like wind and solar energy more popular with developers, even as it becomes less popular with the federal government under the Trump administration. But the lower costs also mean there are fewer government subsidies available. A new article from Bloomberg explains all of this, and the story's co-author, Mark Chediak, joins me now to talk about it. Good to see you.
Nice to have, and thanks for having me on your show.
So first, Mark, let's talk about the history of wind and solar in America. How has its deployment changed just over the last couple of decades?
Yeah, that's a great question. Essentially, what's happened here is in the early days of the technology, wind and solar were a bit expensive to develop. So the government, both federal and certain state governments, provided generous subsidies to help get the technologies off the ground. But what we've seen in the last 10 years is a dramatic drop in cost in both wind and solar. Wind is down about 50% in cost, solar even more, about 85%. And so what that has done is made those technologies a lot more competitive with conventional fossil fuel power plants.
And you also said in your piece that government aid is starting to fade away. Can you explain a little bit more of that?
Yeah, that's correct. So as these technologies have come down in cost, governments across the globe have decided that there's less of a need for these sort of financial incentives to get these kinds of technologies on the grid. So what you see in places like Spain and Italy is the governments have withdrawn certain generous subsidies for things like solar plants. The same thing is happening in Italy. In China, for example, wind will have to bid into their electricity grid by 2021 without any sort of subsidy, and they'll have to, that technology, wind, will have to compete with coal. In the United States, it's a little bit different picture. Wind and solar both get tax credits for development, and the industries are fighting to extend those tax credits. However, in certain markets, in certain places like in Texas, we're starting to see where the cost of solar has come down so significantly that the technology can compete in the competitive energy market there.
So, as you know, the president often rails against windmills in speeches. What's the political element to all of this in the United States?
That's a great question. Well, you have a couple things going on here. One, you have the fossil fuel industry, which has pretty much dominated the power generation sector for decades. They now see this as a threat, so they are pushing back against the development of these technologies. The second thing that's going on here is that you still do have a need for government support for some of these technologies in some of these states. So the fossil fuel industry would like to see those go away. The other political element here is essentially or it's not a political element, it's more of an issue of how the technology is deployed. Essentially, wind and solar don't produce energy around the clock. So, so there needs to be a way for that energy to be backstopped now.
So how does the United States compare to other countries in the use of renewables? When I travel to Europe, I see windmills as far as the eye can see in some countries.
Yes, so in the United States, renewables still make up a very small part of the energy mix. In other places like Germany, it's actually quite substantial now. And some days in Germany, wind power and solar make up the vast majority of power flowing onto the grid. That's because that country has, for a long time now, provided very generous subsidies for those technologies and invested in those technologies. Similar across Europe, Europe has the issue of they don't have the same sort of access to fossil fuels as the United States does. So they were faster to try to move away from that technology.
So, of course, the question then becomes, what does this all mean for the future of renewables? Do you expect that private industry will make the switch despite the lack of subsidies or the weakness in some of the subsidies and obviously political opposition?
I think that's something we're going to see despite this opposition. For example, last week we saw Google sign the largest corporate contract ever for solar and wind farms, and that's simply because they see that technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. Other corporations are coming out and in making these commitments to go 100% renewable energy. So, and that's really, a lot of it has to do with just the price of it having come down. So despite certain governments not supporting the technologies, I think we're going to continue to see it. We're going to continue to see them deployed on the grid.
All right. A really interesting report. Mark Chediak, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.